Good morning and welcome to the David and David on Real Estate episode. We are today on episode number 107. David Corman, welcome.
Thank you. We're going to do an episode today discussing some recent changes in the law that applies to how your business is run. You as a real estate brokerage have been governed by the Real Estate and Business Brokers Act. There's been a change in legislation, and change in the name of the act. So it's the Trust and Real Estates Act. Short form is Tresa. So we're going from REBA to Tresa. And just did a a webinar at your office last week to update agents on it, because it's really important. It's important for you as an owner broker. It's important for every single agent to know the differences and what's new. So we're going to address some of those issues today.
Yeah, really looking forward to this. I think there's a lot of questions on the new Tresa Act. So especially as it relates to disclosure requirements. So really happy to have you on, David, and really go into this. Now, Section 22 of the Act basically says that a seller has a legal obligation to disclose a fact to the buyer, and that fact is known to the broker or sales person who represents the seller. The broker or salesperson shall disclose the fact to every buyer who expresses an interest in the real estate. So quite a lengthy paragraph, but I'm really hoping that we can unpack it together, and really teach realtors, what this means in terms of patent and latent defects and how they should be handled.
Yeah. So first comment I'll give it, like, this isn't brand new. Okay. Under the old act, there were still rules about disclosure and what a seller's supposed to do, what a seller's agent's supposed to do, and how they're governed. The new act just tries to go a little bit further and say, okay, well, we said you got to disclose, so let's give a little more information about what does that mean to disclose. How do you disclose? It doesn't sort of fundamentally change what you have to disclose. It sort of talks a little more about, make sure you disclose it. This is how you're supposed to disclose it, and this is how you're supposed to keep track of the fact you disclose in case you get challenged. Because keep in mind, most of the changes in this act are designed for consumer protection. Like, the whole purpose of updating the act is to try and create more confidence in the industry, that when I'm dealing with a real estate agent or I'm dealing with their brokerage, I can be confident that they're complying with certain rules and regulations. And if they go offside, I know there's some teeth in the legislation where RICO can come after them and enforce their rules and have disciplinary procedures, blah, blah, blah. Because if there is teeth in it, then you're going to get more compliance by the agents and the brokers to not go offside. And so that's sort of where, a lot of the changes, like, the reason for a lot of the changes. They're trying to codify some of these changes, the disclosure requirements, the code of ethics. It's not like there never was a code of ethics before, or there weren't disclosure requirements. They're just taking the next step to try and say, okay, yeah, you have a duty to disclose, and this is what that means.
So what does it mean when the first part of that paragraph says that you have a legal obligation to disclose? At what stage would a seller have a legal obligation to disclose?
Well, in terms of what they have to disclose, a lot of the discussion is the difference between what we call a patent defect and a latent defect. So a patent defect is something that sort of anybody doesn't have to be disclosed by a seller, because someone can come in their house and sort of apparent that there's some damage or something wrong, or you can see the walls are wet, there's a leak, or it's like anybody that be walking in could see that. So you don't have to point it out to them. But by the way, we've got a leak over there, because anybody can see it. Versus a latent defect, which is a defect that you can't see, that the seller might know about, but anybody just doing a normal routine inspection thing wouldn't be able to see it. So the law has always been that the seller does have a duty to disclose those type of things if it makes the property potentially uninhabitable or unsafe to be in. So there is a duty of disclosure by a seller for those type of things. Okay, but what we really sort of want to focus on, what's the duty of a seller's agent to disclose? Okay.
This is where it gets interesting, right? Because if you're a lawyer, you have fiduciary duties to your clients and you don't have the same disclosure requirements.
Right. Yeah, exactly. When it's from my end, I can know about the defect or whatever because my clients told me, but I can't tell anybody about it because my duty is strictly as a lawyer to my client. I've taken my client's instructions. Okay, so I don't have any obligation to disclose. That's not the same for an agent, a real estate agent. Okay, they have to comply with their RICO obligations, and RICO is the governing body that administers what was a REBA Act and now the Tresa Act, and it's what's governed you guys. So you have to comply with that, and so you have to act honestly and in good faith and truthfully. So if you as an agent know about a defect and the buyer or the buyer's agent asks you about it, you have to answer honestly and truthfully. So you can refuse to answer. But if you're on the buyer's side and the seller's is refusing to answer, that's telling you something, right? But you can't disclose unless the seller instructs you to disclose. So you got to go back to the seller and say, hey, they're asking about this thing. Do you want me to tell them about it or not? Because I can't tell them, I can't lie to them. I can't misrepresent it. So I either have to be silent about it or I have to disclose it. But you got to take instructions from your seller. And if the seller says, I don't want you to tell them about it, then you have to decline to continue to act for that seller.
Right. And David, I just want to unpack this a little bit because you said be silent about it. And by be silent about it, we're not inferring that you ignore the question, right? So you still have a duty to answer the question.
Yes.
But by answering the question, you have to say, oh, I acknowledge receiving this question and I'm going to decline to answer the question. You can't just stay silent, right? So that's the biggest issue here, is that you have to make an attempt to answer the question, but you have to follow the directions of your seller. So if your seller says, hey, I don't want you to disclose this, then you have to basically say, hey, I'm answering your question by not answering your question. So you have to,
by telling you I'm not answering,
and that by
I'm declining to answer your question.
Or declining to answer your question. And then at that point, you have to remove yourself from representing the client. You can no longer go ahead and represent them. So, it's a tough situation to be in as a real estate professional, because obviously, realtors are going to want to see that transaction through to the end and be there and help their clients and make sure that they see the transaction to fruition. But at the same time, the Tresa Act, it makes it very clear that if there's a latent defect that the seller knows that has an impact on the house and makes it uninhabitable or structurally unsound, then you must disclose. And that is something that you have to coach the seller and get them to comply, which, puts the real estate professional in an awkward spot, because you have to be the bearer of bad news and basically say, no, look, it's a latent defect, makes the house uninhabitable, structurally unsound. We have a duty to disclose. You have a duty to disclose.
The seller has a duty to disclose.
The seller has a duty to disclose. And now the realtor also has a duty to disclose, but has to follow the lawful instructions of the seller. And if the seller doesn't give them permission, you still have to answer the question by not answering the question, but then you have to also remove yourself from representing that client. So,
right.
Creates a little bit of an awkward situation, but realtors really need to understand this, because we're going to be guiding our sellers and our clients through these situations. And what the Tresa Act does as well, David, is now it puts all the obligation on finding those material facts on the buyer agent, right? So basically, Tresa Act basically says, hey, at every single opportunity, if you're the buyer agent or the cooperation agent, you must make an attempt to make a determination if any of these adverse reactions exist when representing a client. So, and that has to be done in writing, and you have to retain proof of that for your record. And if there is anything that comes back, you have to share that with the buyer and also tell them that you've made an attempt to obtain this information from the seller. So, nothing new here. Realtors should always have been doing this, but now it's just a little bit more formalized. There's a little bit more substance, and there's a little bit more rules and procedures being outlined, and more structure being given in these situations.
Yeah, so I think one of the key things you said there, David, was you said it's up to the agent to coach their client. Okay. I think that's maybe the biggest takeaway that agents listening and watching this should take from this, because let's say you are an agent, you are in that situation, you've got a latent defect in there, and the seller knows about it. So now you've told your seller you have an obligation to disclose this. Seller says, I don't want to do that. I don't want you to do that. And then you explain to them, well, you're going to have to withdraw your services because you have to act honestly in good faith, blah, blah, blah. You explain the whole, what rules that govern you. But the other part of the argument you should be making to the seller is, if I have to back out because you're sort of forcing me to withdraw from this, then you're going to retain the next guy, and he's going to have the same issue, right? He's going to have the same duty to disclose. If that next seller's agent is doing a proper, thorough job, I'm taking over this list, I'm going to sell this house, and they go through the house and see what it's all about, and they find out, if they do everything, they ask all the right questions, it's going to become apparent to them too that there's a defect that the seller knows about. So they're going to have the same issue, unless that seller is completely prepared to just lie and commit fraud and not, and put that agent in the next agent in a bad position. But as an agent, you got to be very careful. You got to do your homework and be diligent in asking questions. And that's what this, what this law is really saying to you. You've got to be careful, and you've got to be asking the right questions, the seller, doing your own due diligence to probably understand the property. And if you've done that and you assume that the next guy is going to do it too, your argument to the seller is going to be, this issue exists. It doesn't go away. The latent defect doesn't go away just because I have to withdraw as an agent. You still have an obligation to disclose this. And the next agent's going to have the same issue. So let's deal with it up front and either fix the latent defect, spend the money to fix it, and then you don't have to disclose it because you've repaired it properly, or you're selling it subject to the latent defect, and the price will be affected accordingly. And you give guidance as to what it might do to the price, et cetera, or the market. And eventually the house is going to sell to somebody. It's a question of to who and at what price. Someone that was going to buy it and they were going to renovate it anyways. And maybe that latent defect doesn't matter to them because they were planning to do a major renovation. They would have fixed that issue anyways. Okay. But the key is you are the agent. You're supposed to be managing your client and informing your client and giving them the right advice. Now, the second part of this is, okay, so if you are going to disclose, the act goes into further detail of what that means to disclose and how you got to keep track of it and keep records of the disclosure. Okay, and some of it is, when you are disclosing stuff, you've got to try and do it in plain language that's easily understood by anybody. Make it clear, make it concise. Like, these are things we sort of take for granted. We're going to disclose, should be proper disclosure. So now the law is being codified. So yeah, you got to go into detail. You got to make it clear. You can't make it overly complicated. You got to make so anybody can understand what you're disclosing. So make sure you bring it to the attention of the other parties and so they can understand it. Not so you're saying, hey, we got a bit of an issue here, and you're still trying to hide it a little bit and not explaining the extent of the problem. And if you
Right.
have to disclose, you got to disclose properly.
No
Okay.
dancing around the issue. And you got to get a written acknowledgement of the disclosure as well.
Right. Right. And that's the other thing that the legislation refers to. Like there's a lot of cover your ass type of requirements here where it used to be just good practice. And now they're saying, you better do it that way because it'll come back and bite you if you don't, because now you're going to be offside with the rules and regulations. So I know you've been coaching agents and I've been coaching agents for many years about, if something happens in the course of a transaction, put it in writing to confirm it with the other side, whether it's an email, whether it's a text. There's no specific requirement for the form of disclosure and the acknowledgement, but make sure you put it in writing and you get them to acknowledge receipt of it. Okay, because that's their opportunity. They might reply, received, thanks, or they might reply, received, but we got a bunch. It's not very clear and concise, and then we have more questions. And please clarify, right?
Yeah.
But they're saying you better put it in writing in one form or another, and get them to acknowledge it as well. So there's evidence, and then store that somewhere. Like don't let it disappear from your phone or from your emails. You have to store that information because you might need it to defend your position.
So David, does this mean that, essentially this is the end of caveat emptor?
No, I don't think it's the end of it. Caveat emptor is the principle: buyer beware. Buyer, do your own due diligence and take a look, which is great. You might sell a property as is, where it is. We're not telling you anything about it. Come in and do your inspections, satisfy yourself. Okay, that is fine, but it doesn't protect a buyer against a latent defect. If something is hidden and they're not allowed to come in and do an inspection and start opening up drywall to see if there's mold behind it. Okay, they can do an inspection, but they can't do an invasive inspection. So if a seller has knowledge of a latent defect, they still have to have a duty to disclose it. Okay, the caveat emptor and the buyer might come into play for everything else. Like that's really for more of a patent defect. You come in, you do your thing, whatever's visible to you, whatever your inspector can find out, let us know if you find anything, but we have no obligation to tell you about that. But that principle of caveat doesn't protect or defend, a position of hiding something from a potential buyer.
Right.
When you have knowledge of it. If a seller doesn't know that there's mold in the wall, they don't have duty to go and open up their own walls to see if they do have it. It's only if they know about it, they can't take steps to conceal it, and they have to either fix it, and then they don't have to say anything about it if it's fixed properly, or they have to disclose it if it's still there.
Right. I think, and I would caution listing agents to limit pre-listing inspections on their properties because of these new rules, right? So now if the seller is notified about something that they didn't know about before because of these new disclosure rules, and I mean, these disclosure rules have really always been in place. So this is really nothing new. But I think with the added intensity of these disclosure rules, I really would caution listing agents to limit listing inspections. The other thing is, if you allow a buyer to do a listing inspection, or not a listing by property inspection, before an offer presentation date, then I would basically maybe get them to sign a piece of paper that they're not going to share the contents of the listing inspection with you nor the seller before that offer presentation, because then you don't have a duty to disclose whatever they find to other potential buyers in the property. So, just be very smart about how you guide and how you coach your clients to some of these situations, and understand your duties and your responsibilities and how they apply to all these situations. It's very important.
Yeah, that's an interesting point, because you can't unknow something once it's been disclosed to you. And once you have knowledge, you have a duty to disclose.
Yeah.
So what this does, like you said, David, it's not brand new. It's good practice. It's what agents should be doing and should have been doing, and keeping notes and confirming things to other parties and acknowledging it and keeping records of all those things. But now they've just sort of codified it in the new act and regulations, saying no, you have to do it. And if there is a complaint or an issue comes up, we're going to be the new act also says we can demand to see all your records and all your documents, and we're going to want to see that. And if you don't provide it to us, now we can say that you're obstructing our investigation or obstructing our process, and you can get in more trouble by any obstruction rules than from whatever the original complaint might have been. So you got to be careful. You got to be diligent. Use best practices that are now codified, and protect yourself as an agent. And you're also protecting your seller in the process too, because you're keeping records of this and you're disclosing things properly. Properties will still sell. Don't hide things. That's sort of, the consumer protection aspect of it. Property is what it is. So, and every property will sell. Every property that's a stigmatized property. There was a death, a suicide, it's a haunted house, it was a marijuana grow op. They all sell eventually.
That's an excellent point to the newer realtors or the realtors who are facing, one of these troubled properties that think that they have to hide and not disclose this. You do not. You don't have to hide this from appraisers. You don't have to hide this from other industry professionals. These stigmatized properties have a certain value, and that value will be supported by the market and by the appraisers. So, make sure you understand these disclosure laws. Don't be afraid. It's always better to be upfront and honest than try to hide something. It will bite you. We're seeing banks really, take a much stronger stance on how they view fraudulent situations, because if you're withholding something from the bank, that could be a fraudulent situation. So don't put yourself out there as a professional, and put your clients in a bad situation. It's better to get a bit of a lower price, but sleep with no guilt, and make sure you have a clear conscience, and protect your integrity and the integrity of the brokerage and the industry. So just keep that in mind. And again, any questions that you have, come see David Corman, come see me. We're happy to help you. Now, David, I have a whole bunch of situations here that I came up with. And in literally 15 seconds or less, I want to play a really quick game. I'm going to ask you, hey, what are the disclosure situations in this situation? And I just want you to really quickly answer these. Let's keep it to less than a minute or so. I'm going to go through a whole bunch of different situations. Let's talk about each one very quickly. And maybe we can turn this into a really fun reel that we can put on social media. But if you're okay, David, grow up. So they have to be disclosed.
Well, by who? By the seller?
By the seller.
Yes.
Even
yes.
if they've been fully remediated?
No. And any property that's been fully remediated, it's fixed. You don't have to, if there was a flood at one point, there was a fire at one point, there was mold at one point, but if it's fully, properly remediated, it's fixed. It doesn't have to be disclosed.
Suicide.
Same issue. Okay. If there's, well, you can't undo a suicide. You can't remediate a suicide, but if a suicide happened, a seller has to follow the lead of sellers need to follow the lead of their seller client on that, because a seller doesn't have a duty to disclose that, but once a seller's agent knows about it, they have a duty to act honestly and in good faith. So if you know there was a suicide and you're asked the question by a buyer, did anybody ever die here, whether it's suicide, murder, or just sick and died there, you have to act. It's that issue. You have to act honestly and in good faith, or decline to answer, and you got to get instructions from your client. But you can't misrepresent or not answer truthfully.
So if your seller says, "Hey, I don't want you to tell anybody that there was a suicide in this house," and you're asked the question, would that be a situation where you have to remove yourself from representation if you decline to answer if the seller gave you instructions to decline to answer that?
Yes. Yes.
Okay. What about a suspicious death? Same issue?
Suspicious. Yeah, it's the same issue. It's the same issue even if someone just is sick and just dies in their house. You know, like if an agent asks you about that, did anybody ever die in this house? You have, and you know that someone did, you can't misrepresent. You can't say no when you have knowledge.
Okay.
Okay.
What
So
about water damage?
water damage, same thing. If it's damaged, if it was fixed, if it was remediated, you have no duty to disclose it. If you can't take steps to hide it and not disclose it.
Okay. So if it's blatant, like if somebody comes in, there's a huge puddle in the basement and the water's there, then it
Well,
would
you
be
don't have to disclose that.
it would be a
That's a
fact.
patent. Anybody would be able to see that. You don't have to put that on your listing. I'm selling this house, and by the way, there's a puddle in the basement, right? It's no anybody that comes in could see there's a puddle and they'll ask questions. If you've drained the puddle and covered up the problem, so you're burying it, knowing it's there, and you're just covering it up for the purpose of showing, now you've crossed the line and you've got to because that's that's non-disclosure of something you should be disclosing.
Okay. What about mold?
Same thing. If you have knowledge of mold, you have a duty to disclose it. Okay. But you don't have a duty if you're going to sell your house to start opening up all your walls to find out if there's mold. Okay. If you know there's mold because it's become apparent and you haven't remediated, if you remediate it, you don't have to disclose it. If you know there's mold and you haven't remediated, you have a duty to disclose.
Foundation crack.
Same thing. Okay. If the foundation, if there's a foundation crack that you know about and there's water coming in or something, if it's apparent, anybody looking at the property would see an obvious foundation crack and there's a problem there, you don't have a duty to disclose it. But if it's something, that there was a foundation crack and you covered it up, you have a duty to disclose it. If there's a foundation crack and you fixed it with professionals, you don't have a duty to disclose.
Aluminum wires.
Meaning like that they're not proper wiring.
Yeah, that the house has aluminum wires instead of copper wires, and the seller knows that they have aluminum wires.
Yeah, I don't think you have a duty to disclose that unless you have some reason to know that it's inherently dangerous and making the property unfit. But it also it depends, like, are these wires, would on an inspection, would anybody easily see that those are the type of wires that are there, right?
Yeah, on inspection, you could easily tell that they're aluminum wires.
Right. So you wouldn't have a duty to disclose that if it's apparent to anybody. If the wires are all completely buried, the same thing with the plumbing. Maybe that's your next question with the type of type of pipes that are there. But if it's exposed and you can see what type of pipes there are, you don't really have to disclose it. But if it's all buried and hidden and there's a problem with it, then that's when it crosses the line and you have a duty to disclose, because that could make the place uninhabitable or unsafe.
All right, termites.
Good to have termites. It's the same thing. Did you fix the problem? If you fixed it and it's no longer there, you have no duty to disclose. If you never knew that there was termites and somebody else finds it out because on inspection somebody looks and says, "Oh, you have termite," you never knew, so you didn't have a duty to disclose to that one. But now you have knowledge, and you're going to have to disclose it to the next party, unless you remediate and fix it, because it can make the property unsafe, uninhabitable.
Structural issues.
I think it's the same issue. Have the structural issues been fixed and repaired? Or there's structural issues that potentially can make the place uninhabitable and dangerous. You can't hide it. And if you know about it, it's unsafe and it hasn't remediated, you'd have a duty to disclose, because that would be a latent defect.
What about upcoming maintenance issues? Things that you're going to have to spend No, thousands of dollars on this issue, but it's upcoming. It's not apparent right now, but you've been informed that sometime in the future this is going to occur. Um, and maybe the most obvious one is a furnace replacement. Like, your furnace works today, but you had it serviced last week, and the technician told you, listen, this furnace it's on its last legs, and you are going to have to replace the furnace in the next 90 days or something like that. Would you have a duty to disclose that?
Well, I think any inspector that you bring in would be coming in and they'd be looking at the furnace, and if they had concern, if they can see, the house is 20 years old and it looks like it's the original furnace. And sometimes there's stickers on it about the maintenance program, or you can be asking questions. Can you provide us with your last inspection? When was the last time it was maintained? And the reluctance of someone to provide that information to you raises red flags. Okay, but I think it's something that they would be normally checking out on an inspection, and they'd be raising those issues at that time. Okay, there's nothing unusual about a furnace, that's already 20 years old being on its last legs. It would sort of be expected that it might be on its last legs, and the buyer might buy it, and it might last for another year or two, or it might fall apart the day after closing, and that's when you're in a buyer beware type of caveat emptor situation. Well, you weren't buying something brand new with brand new appliances and brand new furnace and brand new filter systems, and you're buying what it is. Okay, now if the seller knows it's not working, the furnace is not working, and you tell a guy, just try and get this working for the next 20 minutes because I have a showing. In that fact situation, maybe it's crossed the line as a duty to disclose. That it's not working, or it potentially could be blowing up or be a hazard. You would certainly have a duty to disclose that.
Awesome, David. Well, thank you. Sorry for putting you on the spot. I feel like I pinned you against the wall, and please, anybody that has questions about any of this, please contact David Korman, myself. Happy to explain it to you. By no means is this a definitive legal opinion. It's just
Oh, it's not. Yes, we should add some disclaimers. These are just general principles that apply to these situations, but the real point is you got to look at every single fact situation on its own before you can really give the proper answers. I was making certain assumptions in my head as you're rapid firing these things,
right?
And without trying to be evasive, trying to answer, but every single fact situation can be a little bit different, and it might change the answers that I just gave.
Right. Like the first one I asked you about grow ops, and you said yes, and then I said, well, what has been fully remediated? Well, then you don't, right? If it's just stigmatized, then that latent defect isn't there anymore, and you don't have to disclose. So
don't have to disclose it just because it's stigmatized, just because it was a grow up at one point in time, or because someone died at some point in time, or someone thinks it was haunted at some point in time. There's always a buyer that'll buy that anyways, because that's a personal thing. They're either going to be comfortable or they're not comfortable. The real issue with a grow up is there mold? Okay, is there mold? But if it's all been remediated and there is no mold, then there is nothing to disclose.
Right. Right. So the issue is twofold with the grow ups. It's, is there mold, and does that adversely affect the living conditions in the property? Because the fact that it was a grow up in and of itself means really nothing.
Nothing.
It's
except effects. Right. Now, some buyer, when he finds out it was a grow up 20 years ago, they say, I'm not comfortable, even though I know you're telling me it was all rectified and remediated. I'd rather just buy something else. Okay. But in and of itself, that something was fixed doesn't mean it has to be disclosed. You can have a fire, that takes down, a quarter of your house or something, and then you fix it and you rebuild it and you clean it all out, and there's nothing toxic, there's nothing dangerous in it. You're putting, you're rebuilding it brand new to that. You don't have a duty to disclose that there was a fire 10 years ago or 20 years ago. It's not material. This is the house right now. There's no hazard, nothing making it unfit for habitation. So there's no duty to disclose something like that.
Awesome. Well, David, as always, very informative. Thank you so much. And again, guys, any questions, any concerns, any comments, please reach out to David Corman and myself. Happy to take your answers. And David, thank you for going through those different scenarios. I think that was really useful, really helpful, and I think we really helped realtors understand their duties and their responsibilities as it comes to disclosure on both the listing and the buying side. Thank you, guys.
Thank you.